Regarde.
A few weeks ago, I was chopping up some veg on a Saturday night for a minestrone soup whilst listening to an interview with the writer Mark Haber, whose book I just read and adored. Haber remarks at one point to the podcast host Ben Lindner that in his book, this novel, Lesser Ruins, the digressions have their own digressions. But I go on, sorry.
Yeah.
I will. Anyway, so this comment prompted an inward chuckle. And if you do this whilst cutting carrots, a little bit stoned, you might suddenly, yes, rendering one of your fingers into a kind of a bloodied, mutilated bone poking through deep slash in the flesh carrot. But I digress. Also, that's a lie, which is perhaps appropriate for the topic of digression as both digressing and lying, which is to say writing fiction, stand-up, comedy bits, content, as it is called here, share a relationship rooted in narrative manipulation and the subversion of expectation. Digression at its core is a deliberate departure from a primary line of thought. The Latin root of the word literally means to deviate or walk away from a set course, which is also fundamentally how our works. Seeming to make the process of focused meditation, for example, classic Buddhist sense, resting equanimously with the breath, sensation, sound, trying to do that, difficult. I don't know what Mark said to Ben after the comment about digressions, because my mind had already veered off course, no doubt, somewhat assisted by the green stuff. But even without it, this ADHD-like cognitive drift is a familiar and often sought-after mental release, like a dog, after a bone, precisely because of how stultifying, right, our usual tracks of thoughts can be. I'm talking about the mind's default pathways, predictable, procedural, relentlessly goal-oriented, which, while essential for getting things done, can often feel like trudging through a narrow, claustrophobic corridor hemmed in by tasks, obligations, and the deadening repetition of routine. And then suddenly, and very happily, a digressive rabbit hole opens, a breach in a mental fence, and we're off, scampering down an uncharted wayward path, intoxicated by the sheer freedom of associative thinking, giddy with all the possibilities it might bring, if you're an idiot. And perhaps, even thinks this veg-chopping idiot, he might make a video about digressions, starting with this very scene, in which case some kind of, establishing shot would be needed, perhaps of him chopping vegetable matter, both from the side and from above, chopping board, POV as it were, POV being, of course, a term now mainly associated with porn and gaming, but originally rooted in art, Da Vinci's mastery of perspective in Renaissance painting, philosophy, Kant's meditations on subjective experience, and film, Hitchcock. POV to build suspense in Rear Window, Psycho, Jacques Tati. Indeed. Yet how to film POV chopping when both hands are needed for the steading of root vegetables, lest the knife slip and remove a digit or two? Of course. Perhaps some kind of, cranial affixed platform, maybe we need that, So begins the experiment with, plastic clothes hangers, various hat options fail to provide the necessary stability or dignity. Perhaps another Heath Robinson-esque solution might involve attaching the camera platform, in this case, a wooden coat hanger, to his braces using garden twine or string, a precarious setup requiring much fiddling, repeated adjustments, inevitably more filming in a sort of never-ending loop of invention and absurdity. And wouldn't it be fun, perhaps, if Max himself might be shown watching this digressive spectacle with curiosity and bemusement, even though the dear boy is now totally blind and can't actually participate in these affairs the way he did before? Oolong. Maybe, waving some meaty treats in front of his head might simulate the effect the idiot needs for his shot. And this would then no doubt require another shot to undercut the ridiculousness of the whole folderol. Perhaps a point of view from Max's perspective, looking up at the idiot conducting or directing the pooch in the silent farce. Digression, digression, digression.
One of the things I really like with Montaigne is that he doesn't just talk about how you should live at all. He doesn't really talk about that, or even how he wants to live. He often just observes himself living, and he talks, when he says comment vivre, it means more like, how am I living? What am I doing? What have I done in the past? And what am I doing now? And so there's a curiosity as well as a desire to improve.
Needless to say, the whole process of, prepping the veg for dinner took over an hour, maybe 2, as opposed to 10 minutes. But isn't this what we're seeking in our digressive wanderings? A purposeful detour from the efficient, the linear, the ruthlessly practical. A moment where time loosens its grip, where the mundane transforms into something richly textured, sort of half task, half reverie. Offering not just chopped veg or a bowl of soup, but a kind of story unfolding into and out of the act itself. Digression, whether verbal, visual, or structural, is inherently a creative act, often unfolding without clear transitions or explicit logic. The creative process, whether building a makeshift camera rig from coat hangers, composing music, sketching a design, or improvising dialogue, frequently obscures the true direction, which is linking these seemingly unrelated ideas, materials, or impulses through these associative threaded leaps. Freud described dreams as connecting surface images to hidden meanings and digressions when seen in retrospect, often seemingly guided by a similar unconscious pull. The thread, there's a thread being followed, unexpected, indirect, yet strangely purposeful. The literary critic Sandra Shaw describes the pleasures of digression as offering a kind of exhilarating free fall into an otherwise determined universe, rupturing the expected flow of discourse, making room for this entirely different kind of expression, an interruption that is non-discursive yet also fully embedded within the larger conversation, within the security of that. Digression maintains a kind of natural, though not strictly necessary, connection to its starting point, but it's defined more by its ability to detach and wander than by any inherent remoteness or far-fetchedness, that those qualities can also emerge. Ultimately, its success hinges on its immediate compelling presence, right? Whether it's captivating us in the moment or not. And then, as in now, whether it captures another in the same way or doesn't.
On est un grand garçon. On est bien sage. Moi, je connais de jolies histoires. Et je fais de belles cocottes en papier.
Even though Montaigne was exploring this in an exemplary fashion 500 years ago, most notably in his final masterful essay, Experience, where every sentence feels like its own miniature, highly quotable digression, we now inhabit an almost wholly digressive culture at almost every level, right? Social media timelines, YouTube recommendations, and algorithmically curated feeds thrive on digression. My whole YouTube feed is a digressive blah, rewarding interruption and detour. Each click becomes its own fork in the road, pulling us into a web of very loosely connected content that promises endless discovery, though it often also results, as we know, in disorienting drift. And perhaps this is because Montaigne's digressions were deliberate acts of self-inquiry and philosophical exploration, where today's digressive culture, and who knows, maybe even these things, often feel less like mindful wandering and more like being swept along by a current far too strong to resist. His essays map the erratic, often unpredictable course of thought, while our algorithm-driven experience seems designed to manipulate and exploit that same tendency, turning what was once an art of thoughtful exploration into a system of compulsive distraction. Max, do you really need to be drinking water while I'm making a YouTube video? Ah, Maxie. The allure of digression, Max, remains fundamentally the same, the promise of discovery, surprise, and imaginative expansion. I had no intention of reading Montaigne's essays this year, or, Sarah Bakewell's riveting book-length study of Montaigne, nor was I aware of the final heart-rending book by the Jewish Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, also about Montaigne. So Zweig, having discovered a dusty old copy of Montaigne's essays whilst exiled in 1941 in Petropolis, Brazil, stateless, displaced, increasingly disillusioned by the destruction of European culture and civilization by the Nazis, discovers in Montaigne and in his, his personal as well as sort of artful digressions, not just an intellectual refuge and some philosophical clarity, but something profoundly consolatory, a sort of steady, humane voice that seems to reach out across the centuries. And many who read his work, even today, describe a similar response. In Montaigne, Zweig, I think it's Zweig, isn't it, encountered not only a thinker and a fellow writer, but a companion for the final months of his life before he and his wife, overcome by the hopelessness about the future. I'm not sure why. I need to look into it, right? They proceeded to take their own lives. Who would have thought that Harper's novel, the podcast interviews with the writer, and then my own digressive carrot-chopping reverie might result in such a satisfying creative and literary detour, at least for me. But that's the nature of digressions, I would say, luring us away from the expected, the same old is what isness of existence, pulling us into strange, stimulating and often uncharted territories. Any, or perhaps every, creative act, from the repurposing of a wooden coat hanger into a mobile phone filming rig to the creation of an essay, a novel, or a poem, requires a kind of digressive mindset to break free from the constraints of linear thinking and embrace the unpredictable. It's this openness to deviation, to following an unexpected idea down an uncertain path, that transforms, we might say, mundane materials like this, or scattered thoughts into something original, meaningful, something you can kind of chew on. I find shelter where the storm drives me is this quote from Horace's epistles that Montaigne had painted onto one of the wooden beams in his library, where he spent many a happy hour lost in contemplative wanderings. Many of the inscriptions on those beams speak to the freedom of digression, the willingness to be carried by a current of thought rather than resisting it, finding meaning not through rigid purpose, but through a kind of surrender to the unpredictable winds of curiosity and reflection. I've always loved that simple, yearning, early Beatles song called "There's a Place," hinting at a world opening up to us, not through external events, but by the sort of sudden arrival of a mysterious meaning from within, where thoughts digressively wander and emotions rise unbidden, where a kind of possibility awaits us somewhere over, no, that's a different song, just beyond the edge of conscious intention. A kind of heaven, if you think about it, one of the many promises of Eros. And where is that heaven to be found, Steve, you say? Tell us, we who have watched till the end of the video. Well,
There is a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind, and there's no time when I'm alone. I think of you and things you do go around my head, the things you said, like I love only you. In my mind there's no sorrow, don't you know that it's so? There'll be no sad tomorrow, don't you know that it's so? There is a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind, and there's no time when I'm alone. There's a place, there's a place, there's a place, there's a place.
Alors voilà mon idée. Dimanche, j'organise pour eux une petite réception. On réunit quelques amis, comme ça.